It was supposed to be just another scripted town hall, until President Trump leaned in and asked Denzel Washington a question no one expected. It wasn't loud, it wasn't direct, but it cut like a blade. What happened next wasn't a comeback. It was a reckoning, one that started with silence and ended with an entire country watching. If you think you know what power sounds like, wait until you hear what Denzel said next. It was supposed to be just another campaign photo op, another tightly scripted stop on the Voices of America tour. The venue, a high school gym in Dayton, Ohio, scrubbed clean and dressed to impress. Rows of folding chairs gleamed beneath fluorescent lights. Banners hung neatly from the rafters, stronger communities, safer streets. Everything about the room said controlled, planned, predictable, and that's exactly how the president liked it. President Donald J. Trump entered to polite applause, flanked by aides and camera crews, smiling just wide enough to look casual without giving up control. He moved through the crowd like a man gliding down a red carpet, stopping just long enough for handshakes, small talk, flashes. Near the third row, he reached out to shake the hand of Denzel Washington, who stood when called, offered a brief nod, and returned the gesture. It should have ended there. But as Trump turned to move on, he leaned in toward an aide just behind him, not realizing his lapel mic was still hot. Did he even finish college? He muttered with a half smirk. Sounds smart for an actor. The words slipped like a whisper, but they landed like a punch. Two camera operators glanced at each other. A young woman in the press row froze mid-note. The murmur started slow, just a shift in the room's energy, but it spread like a ripple in glass. Denzel didn't react. He didn't flinch. His hands stayed folded, his eyes calm, but something behind them shifted just slightly. A window closed. What the president didn't know, what no one in that gym knew yet, was that Denzel had already decided how this night would go. Hours earlier, sitting alone in the backseat of a black SUV outside the venue, Denzel had scrolled through a text from his mother. Just 6 words. Roof collapsed again, room 6B again. Attached was a photo, low resolution, grainy but sharp enough. A classroom, desks covered in plaster. A single torn poster clinging to the wall behind a soaked whiteboard. Beneath it, a faded name tag still taped to a corner of the chalk tray, Mrs. Holland. Room 6B, that was his room. The room where he first stood up in front of 30 kids and read Langston Hughes out loud, while a ceiling fan buzzed overhead and rainwater leaked into a trash can in the corner. The room where he learned how to speak, not to impress, but to be heard. Where he learned that words, when chosen right, didn't need to be loud to land hard, just sharp, just true. Now that same room was falling apart. Again. And the people in charge still called it progress. So when Trump whispered his line and smiled like nothing had happened, Denzel didn't react, not outwardly. He simply sat, one leg crossed over the other. A small spiral notebook resting in his lap, a black pen between his fingers. On the inside cover of the notebook was a square of yellowed paper, taped at the edges and worn from time. A note from Mrs. Holland, written decades ago in blue ink: never speak to impress, speak to lift, and speak slow so they can't look away. Now backstage, a producer whispered into an earpiece, "We're live in 60. A stage manager adjusted lights. Everything moved like clockwork, except one thing: Denzel's silence. Not awkward, not defiant, just still. So still it made people notice. In the second row, a school superintendent from Cincinnati shifted in his seat. Next to him, a journalist for the Columbus Dispatch whispered, "Why does he look like he's already got the next 10 minutes written in his head?" He did, not because it was rehearsed, but because it was lived. Back on stage, Trump stepped behind the podium. Teleprompter scrolling, smile polished. "We are here today to celebrate the voices of real Americans," he began, "hardworking folks, family people, fighters, survivors, and we're listening." The words rang hollow against the walls. Denzel sat unmoved, eyes locked not on the stage, but just past it. As if watching something no one else could see, the gym's lights buzzed faintly overhead. The cameras panned gently across the crowd. Somewhere, a high school band teacher in the bleachers leaned over to her colleague and said quietly, "That man's holding something back. You feel it." Her colleague nodded. "He's waiting." But it wasn't anger, not pride, not ego. It was weight. Not the kind that breaks you. The kind you carry because someone has to. The kind passed down in classrooms with broken heat, on porches with folding chairs, in kitchens where every dollar counted and every word mattered. Denzel Washington sat in a gym built on broken promises, but tonight he hadn't come to blend in. He hadn't come for applause, and he sure as hell hadn't come to be patronized. He came for room 6B, and the kids still sitting in it. And whether the president knew it yet or not, that one careless whisper had just lit a fuse. The room moved on, but Denzel didn't. As questions floated from the crowd, softballs tossed like confetti, he sat unmoved, hands folded over the spiral notebook now closed in his lap. His face gave away nothing, not annoyance, not discomfort, not pride, just stillness, so precise it became louder than any applause. President Trump fielded the first few questions with ease. A small business owner praised deregulation. A sheriff thanked him for supporting law enforcement. A state senator lauded the return of American grit. All according to script. Denzel barely blinked. Beside him, a staffer for a local representative tried to whisper something about the cue card sequence, but Denzel didn't look over. His mind wasn't in this gym, not entirely. It was 2,000 miles away, in a dusty room with peeling paint and a fan that never quite worked, where a kid once stayed late to help his teacher tape up a torn map of the United States. He remembered the sound of chalk snapping, the way the rain tapped the windows like fingers. He remembered the blue sweater Mrs. Holland always wore, even when it was warm, and how her voice lowered when she said something important. She never raised it, not once, not even when kids got rowdy. She slowed it down instead, like she was sharpening every syllable. And when she called on him, that quiet boy in the second row, she didn't do it to test him. She did it to remind him he was ready. "Langston," she said one day, "page 42, take your time, baby." He had. That was the day his voice stopped shaking. Now, decades later, the room may have changed, but the silence before speaking was still sacred. Across the gym, the moderators began rotating through audience cards. The script called for one high school teacher, one pastor, one factory worker, all approved, all safe. None of them were Denzel Washington. Backstage, a young assistant producer tapped her tablet nervously. "He hasn't submitted a question," she whispered. "Is he even going to speak?" Her supervisor didn't look up. "He doesn't have to. If he stands, the room will shift. Just keep the feed clean." Meanwhile, Denzel's fingers traced the edge of the yellowed paper inside his notebook. Mrs. Holland's words, still legible after all these years, "Speak to lift. Speak slow." He knew why he was here. Not for Twitter, not for cameras, not to prove anything to the man at the podium. He was here because he promised his mother he would show up, not for himself, but for the kids in room 6B, the ones who had no mic. No seat in the second row. The ones watching from borrowed Wi-Fi, cracked phone screens, a step behind and always blamed for it. Earlier that day, before the SUV even left the hotel, he'd sat at the edge of his bed and stared at the photo on his phone again. The classroom, his classroom, now gutted, ceiling collapsed, desks shoved into corners like trash, but what hit him hardest wasn't the damage, it was the clock, frozen at 2:37 p.m. The exact minute he once stood up to read What Happens to a Dream Deferred. That was the moment he realized something wasn't just broken in the schools, it was being allowed to stay broken. Now, in this air-conditioned gym, with its polished chairs and flag backdrops, the President of the United States was smiling wide, talking about choice and discipline and how American schools needed more winners, fewer excuses. Denzel watched his hands, Not the face, not the words, the hands, they were too relaxed, too rehearsed. The gestures came a second before the thought. It meant one thing: he wasn't thinking, he was performing. And Denzel had no interest in sharing a stage with a performance. He was waiting for a crack. It came in the form of a pause. Trump flipped his note cards, glanced off stage, then chuckled. Let's open the floor to real voices now. We've got, let's see, Denzel Washington with us tonight. A few scattered claps, some murmurs, a cameraman pivoted. Denzel didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he unfolded from his chair like a man standing in court, not on television. Every eye in the room tracked him, not because of who he was, but because of how he moved. Like time wasn't pushing him forward, he was pulling it toward him. He stepped to the mic. No notes, no cards. Just the notebook in his hand and a look that said everything the room needed to feel. I didn't come here to entertain you. I came to remember. He adjusted the mic once, tapped it lightly. Good evening, Mr. President, he said, voice low but clear. Trump nodded with that familiar smirk, readying his rebuttal like a fencer twitching for the first jab. But Denzel didn't swing. Not yet. He just paused. Then he looked down briefly at the yellowed note in his book, then up again. I'm Denzel Washington, and I'm here tonight, not because I needed to be, but because people back home begged me to be. The gym fell silent again, not tense, not frozen, just waiting, because for the first time all night, they weren't listening to the event. They were listening to the man, and he hadn't even started yet. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The microphone didn't crackle, the lights didn't shift, no dramatic sting from the soundboard. Just the hum of cheap fluorescence, the faint tap of someone's pen hitting a clipboard, and the quiet breath of a gymnasium that suddenly remembered how to listen. Denzel's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight in it came from somewhere else, from years, from rooms that didn't have microphones, from kitchens where arguments happened over rent and dreams, and no one wrote about them. You talk about a booming economy, he said, steady and without venom, but where I come from, all we see are groceries that cost twice as much, and paychecks that haven't moved in 5 years. Trump's lips curled slightly, half grin, half calculation. He nodded, the way someone does when they're waiting for you to walk into their trap. Denzel didn't. Where I come from, he continued, they build billion-dollar stadiums across town, while our schools still have windows that won't open and mold creeping up the corners. A beat, someone in the back muttered something under their breath, but the room held. Even the moderators didn't interrupt. And I have a question, sir, Denzel said, eyes now locked on the president. One that's not on a card and didn't go through your team. Trump raised his chin slightly, a flicker of amusement. Why, Denzel asked, did your administration decide to slash funding for Title I schools? The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was clean, surgical, the kind of silence that walks in before a blade is drawn. Title I schools, Denzel went on, are where millions of low-income kids learn how to read, how to count, how to survive. They're the schools where teachers spend their own money just to buy paper, where textbooks are older than the kids reading them, where the AC doesn't work when it's 94 degrees outside. He paused not to breathe, but to let the truth settle. Last fall, your Department of Education froze grants meant for repairs and updated resources. Schools that already had nothing were told they'd have to wait longer. Trump leaned forward, his elbows resting gently on the table. His eyes narrowed, not with confusion, but calculation. Behind him, one aide's expression cracked for just a moment. Sir, Denzel said, softer now, do you know what it feels like for a child to sit in a classroom with a leaking ceiling and be told that's just the way it is? Trump gave a small chuckle into the mic. Schools in this country have been failing long before I showed up, he replied, tone light, performative. If anything, I'm the one trying to fix it. That's local politics. Talk to your mayor. Denzel blinked once, then leaned forward. "Oh, I have," he said, calm like glass. "I've talked to superintendents, principals, janitors, and you know what they said?" He didn't wait for permission. "They said they've been begging your Department of Education for infrastructure grants for nearly 2 years. You know the ones I'm talking about, the ones paused in November, the ones buried in subcommittee because someone decided broken schools weren't urgent." There was a shift again, not just in the room, but on camera. The lens on Denzel's face focused tighter, and somewhere in the production van out back, a tech whispered, "Don't cut away." Trump inhaled, ready to speak, but Denzel didn't let him. "You want to make America great again?" he asked, voice dipping into something colder now. "Start with the kids who are still learning from books that say Pluto's a planet. Start with the classrooms where teachers pull double shifts and still can't afford their own rent. Start with schools where there's no budget for trauma counselors, but there's always money for more suspensions." A few people started clapping quietly, instinctively, not performatively. But they stopped when Denzel held up his hand gently, not to silence them, but to keep the room steady. "Greatness doesn't come from slogans, Mr. President. It comes from investment where it matters most, and where it's been ignored the longest." Trump leaned back now, hands folding. No smile, no smirk. The moderator fidgeted in her seat, clearly caught between the rules of civility and the reality of what had just been laid bare. The room had shifted, and for a moment the president didn't have control of it anymore. But he wasn't done. Not yet. Trump leaned toward the mic, cocked his head sideways, and smiled the way he does when he thinks he's about to land a punchline. "So tell me," he said, drawing out the pause like a game show host who already knows the answer, "where'd you learn English?" And just like that, the room fell flat, not because it was clever, but because it was. Because everyone knew what that line meant, and they were all waiting, not for the answer, but for the fallout. The air didn't move, the laughter didn't come, just silence, hollow and sharp, like the echo of a mistake. A cameraman swallowed hard, afraid to blink. Beside him, an intern's fingers froze over a tablet, unable to finish typing the words she'd just heard. Denzel stood motionless at the mic, eyes locked on the president, without a single flicker of anger. Not shock, not even surprise, just quiet resolve. This was not new to him. This moment had come before, in classrooms, in boardrooms, in casual conversations where small remarks carried big weight. He'd learned how to respond. More importantly, he'd learned when to respond. He didn't say anything at first. He simply reached into his jacket pocket with a slow, deliberate calm that pulled the room toward him. People leaned forward without realizing, drawn to the gentle tension in the movement, the quiet certainty in his eyes. He withdrew a small piece of paper, creased, slightly faded, softened at the edges from being handled too often. Carefully he unfolded it, smoothing it flat against the podium's polished surface. The camera zoomed in instinctively, capturing blue ink handwritten across yellowed notebook paper, words pennied decades before. "Mrs. Holland's class, room 6B, South Central, Los Angeles. We learned under a leaking roof, but our words stayed sharp." Denzel's fingers rested on the note for a single moment, his eyes briefly lowered. Then he looked back up, directly into the camera lens, not addressing just the president, but everyone listening, everyone who'd ever sat in a classroom just like that one, everyone who knew exactly what that small slip of paper represented. "I learned English," he said, softly yet clearly, "in public schools in Los Angeles, Mr. President." The silence deepened. A breath caught audibly in someone's throat. The president blinked twice, mouth briefly tightening into something between a grimace and a forced grin. But Denzel wasn't finished. "I learned it from teachers whose names you'll never know. Teachers who taped textbooks together and stayed late, long after the heat shut off in winter. Teachers who brought pencils from home because the budget never covered enough. That's where I learned English." He paused, gently tapping his finger on the note. And that's where millions of kids still learn it today, in schools your policies forgot, in rooms you've never seen, from people you've never heard. But those teachers, they never forgot us. Someone in the audience started clapping softly, then stopped quickly, unsure whether applause was even appropriate. Trump glanced briefly toward the moderator, who remained frozen in place, eyes wide, unsure how to regain control. Trump cleared his throat quietly, repositioning his posture, adjusting his tie as if physical comfort could erase what had just happened. "That's a very moving speech," Trump finally managed, voice clipped, tone artificially light. "But let's not forget, my administration has done more." But the moderator finally found her voice, cutting in gently yet firmly. "Mr. President, we need to move on to the next." It didn't matter. Denzel had already stepped away from the podium, folding the small note carefully, placing it back inside his pocket as deliberately as he'd taken it out. He sat slowly, quietly, in the same chair as before, posture unchanged, hands folded neatly, just as calm as he'd been minutes earlier. But everything else had changed. The gravity in the room, the texture of the air, the subtle awareness in each face had shifted into something heavier, sharper, something impossible to dismiss. The moderators tried to push ahead, calling another audience member's name, attempting to reset the rhythm, regain the practiced civility. But in the back row, a teenager whispered softly into her phone, recording quietly as tears welled in her eyes. "Did you hear that? Did you hear what he just said?" In a production truck parked outside, an assistant leaned toward a screen, blinking slowly as numbers began climbing rapidly. Views, shares, retweets. In another 30 seconds, the clip would reach thousands. In 2 minutes, it would reach millions. Back inside, Trump forced a grin, answering a scripted question from someone about healthcare, then another about taxes. But his eyes flicked sideways every few seconds toward Denzel's seat, trying to gauge whether another wave was coming. Another quiet, unstoppable swell that couldn't be contained by rehearsed talking points or polite laughter. Across the gym, a retired schoolteacher quietly stood, slipping toward the exit, phone pressed to her ear. "He said exactly what we've all wanted to say for years," she whispered into the receiver, voice unsteady but full of pride. "He said it calmly, he said it clearly, and he said it on national television." Denzel sat still, letting the room shift around him. He didn't glance at his phone, didn't check the messages flooding in. He simply held that silence like a shield, not against what had been said, but against everything that would come after. Because in that moment, something far bigger had started, and everyone knew it, even if they weren't sure yet what to call it. The room eventually moved on, but outside, the world had already stopped. Before the town hall even ended, the clip, just 39 seconds of video, had begun to surge across timelines, screens, and inboxes. Millions watched Denzel unfold the small, worn slip of paper. Millions replayed those calm, devastating words, spoken without anger, without blame, just quiet truth cutting through noise. Within minutes, the hashtag #WhereWeLearned bloomed to life, not on news channels first, but quietly in kitchens, libraries, break rooms, and bus rides. It started with a ninth grader in Cleveland, Ohio, holding up a battered dictionary from 1987, whispering into her phone camera, "I learned English from books older than me, in rooms that always leaked." Then a steelworker in Gary, Indiana, standing in front of rusted lockers in a shuttered school, his voice heavy and proud. "I learned English from factory workers who took extra shifts to buy me pencils." Then a grandmother from Montgomery, Alabama, eyes bright, words deliberate. "I taught my children English by reading the Bible aloud in a living room with no heat. We learned anyway." Each voice alone was quiet, barely above a whisper. Together, they became something deafening. The producers backstage scrambled desperately, barking instructions, trying to regain control. Someone shouted into an earpiece, "We need to pivot, shift the narrative back to jobs, economy, anything else. But it was already too late. The narrative had left the gym, and no amount of political maneuvering could catch it. On the stage, Trump pushed through remaining questions mechanically, his voice flat, eyes constantly darting to aides who now hovered anxiously near the curtains, glued to screens, shaking their heads silently as if watching water pour through cracks they couldn't plug. Meanwhile, Denzel remained unmoved, calm, eyes steady, notebook resting closed in his lap, untouched. He didn't reach for his phone, even as it vibrated repeatedly, flooding with messages, family, teachers, childhood friends, numbers he hadn't seen in years. He didn't need to look. He felt it already. Something had shifted, not just here, not just online, but somewhere deeper, somewhere foundational. Across America, stories spilled onto screens, shared by people who had never posted before, but who recognized instantly the weight in those simple words. I learned English in the schools your policies forgot. Teachers began sharing images of their classrooms, chairs with broken legs propped up by textbooks, whiteboards permanently stained, desks patched with duct tape. Students showed pencil stubs, books with covers missing, library shelves empty except for donations older than their parents. Then, quietly, in a small apartment kitchen in Detroit, a retired teacher named Gloria recorded herself holding up a faded photograph, black and white, grainy, but unmistakable. "This was my classroom," she said gently, steady hands holding the image close. "Room 6B, same as yours, Mr. Washington. I taught children who had never been told they could do anything. But I made sure they learned English well enough to tell the world who they were." The video spread instantly. No one had known Gloria before, but now everyone did, and they began sharing their own Room 6BS, their own versions of classrooms that shaped them, teachers who saved them, moments that defined them. At the back of the gym, a young journalist from NPR stood holding his microphone close, voice trembling slightly as he narrated what he'd just witnessed. "Tonight, in Dayton, we heard more than a town hall. We heard millions of people suddenly speak at once, and it started with one sentence." Outside, in the crisp Ohio night, crowds had already gathered, spontaneous, quiet, holding homemade signs illuminated by streetlights. A nurse from Akron raised her hand-painted cardboard high. "This is where we learned English," standing in lines, waiting for books, waiting for heat. A bus driver from Youngstown stood beside her, holding a sign written in marker. "We learned English where you refused to look." Inside, Trump had finally stopped glancing toward Denzel, stopped pretending to ignore what had happened. He now stared blankly ahead, shoulders tight, mouth set into a thin line as his aides whispered urgently in the wings, their expressions tense, eyes darting between screens and the stage. The moderator, clearly shaken, cleared her throat awkwardly. Let's wrap things up. Thank you, everyone." People stood slowly, quietly, chairs scraping softly across polished floors. Some looked toward Denzel, hesitant, unsure whether applause or silence was right. He simply nodded once, respectfully, then turned toward the exit, notebook held loosely in his hand. A young teacher from Toledo caught his arm gently as he moved past. She didn't speak, just nodded with gratitude, eyes wet but proud. He returned the nod softly, no words needed. Outside, he could hear the growing crowd, quiet voices blending into something bigger, something stronger, something unplanned and unstoppable. For the first time that night, he allowed himself a small breath, a quiet exhale of recognition, not victory. Because what had started inside that gymnasium was now far beyond him. He'd spoken for Room 6B, but now countless others were speaking for themselves. Within 24 hours, the White House communications team had spun into a frenzy. Phones buzzed urgently, screens flickered with graphs and analytics, aides paced hallways whispering sharply. The president's press secretary stood rigidly before a cluster of microphones, desperately deflecting the torrent of questions now pouring in from every major network. It was a harmless joke, she repeated sharply, voice tense but controlled. The president respects all Americans. It's unfortunate that Congressman Washington chose to misinterpret it. But the words rang hollow against the unstoppable current of voices that had begun speaking out, steady, calm, unignorable. Online, television screens flashed constantly, replaying the quiet moment when Denzel unfolded the paper, the deliberate calm in his voice as he spoke of forgotten classrooms and quiet heroes. On conservative talk shows, pundits lashed out, branding Denzel as overly sensitive, accusing him of playing the victim of manufacturing outrage. Photos surfaced quickly, grainy, decades-old images of a younger Denzel at protest marches, standing quietly behind picket signs, silently carrying banners demanding better funding for schools. But every new attack only seemed to deepen the wave of support. Clips circulated endlessly, juxtaposing Denzel's quiet, careful words against the aggressive, dismissive tone of critics. The hashtag #WhereWeLearned grew faster, shared by people who'd never joined an online movement before, mothers filming children studying under flickering lamps, janitors speaking softly about schools where ceilings never stopped leaking. Denzel himself stayed quiet. He didn't immediately rush to CNN or MSNBC. He politely declined invitations from the most popular late-night hosts, simply sending short, respectful notes saying, "Thank you, but not yet." Instead, he spent the following day visiting a small, forgotten middle school in Columbus, Ohio, far from the cameras and bright lights. No reporters, no press releases, just Denzel walking slowly through empty hallways, pausing occasionally to glance through cracked windows into classrooms filled with battered desks and ancient textbooks. One room was almost identical to room 6B, chalkboard stained, floors worn, chairs mismatched. It felt painfully familiar. A young principal named Alicia greeted him nervously. She didn't ask for selfies, didn't request autographs. Instead, she gently guided him through the building, explaining softly that their last funding request had been denied because the paperwork had gotten lost. He listened silently, nodding slightly, asking quiet questions that drew out details without judgment. As he left, he offered Alicia a quiet handshake, meeting her eyes calmly, steadily. "People will hear you now," he said softly. "Keep speaking." Meanwhile, President Trump doubled down publicly. At an impromptu press conference outside the White House, he waved dismissively at reporters, questions about Denzel, voice sharp, agitated. "People need thicker skin. He's an actor, he knows drama. I was just making conversation." His aides winced off camera, sensing immediately that the defense had backfired again. Social media ignited, anger flaring briefly before cooling once more into steady resolve, voices determined, thoughtful, unwavering. Teachers across America used their lunch breaks to record simple messages. "This isn't drama, it's reality." Behind the scenes, Trump's advisors frantically prepared talking points, suggesting carefully worded apologies, statements of misunderstanding. But Trump brushed them away impatiently, convinced the issue would disappear overnight like so many others had before. It didn't. Instead, something entirely unexpected occurred. Quietly, privately, politicians from both parties began sending messages, first to aides, then directly to Denzel's office, expressing cautious support, solidarity, a shared recognition that something fundamental had shifted. One Republican senator from Ohio quietly messaged, "I can't publicly say this yet, but you made us all stop pretending." By evening, cable news featured segments not about political conflict, but about classrooms, teachers describing crumbling walls, moldy textbooks, silent ceilings leaking quietly into buckets at the back of rooms. These were not fiery debates. They were quiet testimonies, facts offered simply, without outrage, because the outrage had already been felt. Now it was time for action. Denzel finally returned to his hotel room late that night, sitting quietly alone at the edge of the bed. He switched on the television, muted, watching a split-screen replay. On one side, his calm face, unfolding the yellowed slip of paper. On the other, the president's uncomfortable glance, the forced grin. His phone vibrated again, a message from his mother, just 4 simple words: "You made her proud." He smiled slightly, eyes softening, and exhaled slowly. He wasn't interested in political victories or public applause. He wasn't even interested in proving someone wrong. He'd spoken because it needed to be said. Not loudly, not angrily, just truthfully. In the room's soft silence, he picked up his notebook and carefully peeled back the cover once more, fingers gently tracing Mrs. Holland's familiar handwriting. He remembered her quiet voice, years ago, telling him clearly, softly, "When you speak, you carry all of us." He closed the notebook gently, eyes steady, heart calm. He had carried them, teachers, students, parents, in a quiet, deliberate moment. But now he knew clearly he no longer needed to speak alone. Millions were speaking with him. The echo of Denzel's words lingered far longer than the headlines. Weeks turned to months, months to years, and eventually, administrations changed. The cameras moved on, following new faces and fresh controversies. But something quiet had stayed behind, something that refused to fade, anchored not in noise, but in a deeper, lasting silence. 3 years after that night in Dayton, Ohio, a small crowd gathered outside a newly renovated public library in Detroit. No massive media presence, no celebrity guests, just community members quietly waiting, holding paper cups of coffee, jackets zipped against the chill. Beside the main doors, beneath a blue tarp draped carefully, stood something tall and newly installed. A young librarian named Vanessa, nervous but proud, stepped forward. She cleared her throat gently and smiled at the gathered faces: students, parents, teachers, elders, people who had spent lifetimes watching resources flow elsewhere, who had grown accustomed to quiet neglect. Until now, she took hold of the tarp gently, glanced toward the small audience, and carefully pulled it down. Beneath it stood a smooth stone panel, polished, simple. Etched clearly in understated letters were the words: "We learned English in schools your policies forgot, but they never forgot us." Denzel Washington, Dayton, Ohio. There was no applause at first, just silence, quiet and heavy, breathing softly like something alive. Then slowly, one by one, people began nodding quietly, a few dabbing at eyes, others murmuring softly, repeating the words as if they had always known them. At the back, a young mother held her daughter's hand gently, the little girl craning her neck upward, reading slowly. Her small voice carried clearly across the silence, "Who's Denzel Washington?" Her mother knelt gently beside her, smiling softly, answering in a voice that didn't try to teach, only share. "He's someone who spoke up for us, sweetheart. Someone who remembered us." Across the street, a reporter stood quietly, microphone lowered respectfully, camera resting on his shoulder, waiting patiently before approaching the crowd. Today wasn't about stories for the evening news. It was about stories quietly passed down through families, through communities, across kitchen tables and classroom desks. 3 states away, Denzel himself sat quietly at a cafe table, sipping tea, eyes resting on his phone's screen, a soft image of the library dedication frozen in place. He declined to attend, not out of disinterest, but because he wanted this moment to belong entirely to the community, to the people who had carried these words forward themselves. His phone buzzed softly again. Another message from his mother. Gloria Holland's granddaughter just called, said to tell you her grandma would have cried today. He smiled gently, eyes briefly wet, blinking slowly, remembering room 6B, the fan, the rain, the voice that taught him patience, clarity, and courage. Looking up briefly, he caught the eyes of an elderly man sitting 2 tables away, who nodded softly, recognition flickering gently. Denzel returned the nod respectfully, understanding shared in silence. He'd never sought this legacy, not the stone panels, not hashtags, not even headlines. But he understood its weight, its quiet permanence. It wasn't about him, it never had been. It was about everyone who'd ever felt invisible, who'd ever been told to speak softly, to wait quietly, to expect nothing better. After the crowd dispersed, Vanessa returned to the library, unlocking doors, stepping quietly inside. Shelves of new books lined freshly painted walls. Bright lights illuminated clean desks, chairs neatly arranged. At the front, near the circulation desk, a group of eighth graders quietly gathered around their English teacher, asking questions about poetry assignments, each holding notebooks, clean pages, sharpened pencils. She smiled gently at them, pointing toward the new panel visible through the front window, and softly said, "Remember that every word you write here matters, because someone spoke for you long before you ever walked through these doors." Across the country, other cities followed, small, quiet dedications, markers in hallways, quotes painted carefully above blackboards, reminders gentle yet persistent. Quiet revolutions don't always come loudly. Sometimes they happen softly, steadily, growing over time, unplanned yet unstoppable. 2 weeks later, back in Ohio, at a small diner, a waitress paused beside a television, quietly replaying highlights of recent political debates, noisy, aggressive, forgettable. An elderly customer shook his head slightly, voice gentle, wistful. "Remember when that congressman spoke?" He asked quietly, almost to himself. "Remember how he just stood there calmly? That's how it should sound. That's how it sticks." The waitress smiled softly, nodding, refilling his coffee slowly. "Yeah," she whispered, voice barely audible, "we learned how to listen again." And in countless classrooms, hallways, libraries, homes, people who had been silent began to speak. Teachers who had never raised their voices now spoke clearly in meetings. Students who'd always waited quietly began to stand up, notebooks in hand, eyes clear, not with anger, not with noise, but with something deeper, unshakable. Denzel folded his newspaper gently, rose from his cafe seat, leaving a quiet tip beside his empty cup. Walking slowly down the street, hands tucked into his coat pockets, he glanced upward, smiling softly at the blue sky stretching calmly above. He hadn't changed the world overnight. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply reminded people of their own power, their own quiet strength, their own ability to speak calmly, clearly, unforgettably. Because sometimes, the loudest thing you can do is speak quietly enough for people to truly hear you.